why is Mike Pence continuing to be dishonest about his power? When he was vice president, he was in the Senate counting the electoral votes, and he said in response to the indictment, he says, you know, today's indictment serves as an important reminder. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. He says, I'll have more to say about the government's case in which he testified after reviewing the indictment. The former president is entitled to the presumption of innocence, but with this indictment, his candidacy means more talk about J6 and more distractions. He says, as Americans, his candidacy means less attention paid to Joe Biden's disastrous economic policies, which is, I think that's just like a talking point that they just send out to all the GOP people, afflicting millions across the United States, and to the pattern of corruption with Hunter. Our country is more important than one man. Our Constitution is more important than any one man's career. On January 6th, former President Trump demanded that I choose between him and the Constitution. I chose the Constitution, and I always will. As your president, I will not yield an inch in defending America, our people. I promise you, I will do so consistent with my oath to the Constitution and bring real solutions to this nation. Now, he has been saying that he never had the authority to reject the electoral votes when they landed in front of him back on January 6th. And he's out here hitting the media talking about this in several different ways using very colorful language.
And irrespective of the indictment, I want the American people to know that I had no right to overturn the election.
We're going to come back to that. I had no right to overturn the election. First of all, nobody's asking that you overturn the election. That wasn't the question. It's a false premise. He's starting this off on the wrong foot.
And then on that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution, but I chose the Constitution, and I always will. And I really do believe that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States.
Trump didn't.
And anyone who asks someone else to put themselves over the Constitution should never be president of the United States again. I've been very forthright about this issue, and I'll continue to be. Now, with regard to the substance of the indictment, I've been very clear. I had hoped it would come to this. I had hoped that this issue and the judgment of the president's actions that day would be left to the American people. But now it's been brought in a criminal indictment, and I can't assess whether or not the government has the evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what they assert in the indictment. And the president's entitled to a presumption of innocence. But for my part, I want people to know that I had no right to overturn the election, and that what the president maintained that day, and frankly has said over and over again over the last 2.5 years, is completely false.
That is not accurate. We're going to break this down. I've got Congressional Research Service documents, and I've got the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 that say differently.
And it's contrary to what our Constitution and the laws of this country provide. You know, I'm a student of American history.
Not really.
And the first time I heard in early December somebody suggest that as vice president I might be able to decide which votes to reject and which to accept, I knew that it was false. Our founders had just won a war against a king. And the last thing they would have done was vest unilateral authority in any one person to decide who would be the next president. I dismissed it out of hand. Sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear. And while I made my case to him of what I understood my oath to the Constitution to require, the president ultimately, continue to demand that I choose him over the Constitution. So all
right, demand that he chooses Trump over the Constitution. This one's a little shorter.
I was clear on that throughout. I was clear with President Trump throughout all the way up to the morning of January 6th. But let's be clear on this point. It wasn't just that they asked for a pause. The president specifically asked me, and his gaggle of crackpot lawyers asked me to literally reject votes, which would have resulted.
Okay, so that's different than what you said about overturning the election.
In the issue being turned over to the House of Representatives, and literally chaos would have ensued. So.
Not really. It's happened before.
Martha, I just people can read the indictment, and frankly, I've said before, I had hoped it had not come to this point. I don't know if the government can meet the standard, the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt for criminal charges. But the American people deserve to know that President Trump and his advisors didn't just ask me to pause. They asked me to reject votes, return votes, essentially to overturn the election, and to keep faith with the oath that I made to the American people and to Almighty God.
Changing,
I rejected that got out of hand, and I did my duty that day.
All right, so Mike Pence is changing his language a little bit, even between those two interviews, and I think it's the same day. So he's on CNN, language changes, Fox News, he tightens it up a little bit. But here's the point. In 2016, the Congressional Research Service drafted this document for us. 2016, long before 2020. They say, hey, this is how we count electoral votes. It's a big process. A lot of complicated things happening here. An overview of all the things and how this works. And there's one provision in here, one section that's very important. The receipt of two certificates from the same state. Oh, what happens when that happens? What happens when the state legislature that governs how elections work pursuant to the United States Constitution, what happens when they have a difference of opinion than what the executive branch did when they changed the election rules based on COVID? Executive branch comes up with a conclusion. They say, this is how the election went. The legislative branch, a co-equal branch of government, by the way, they decide something else happened, and the legislative branch is arguably more representative than the executive branch because they've got individual legislatures which connect to the population. If you have two competing certificates from the same state, there's a process that we go through. It's complicated. And if you go through all of this, they talk about objections to the counting of electoral votes, the procedures for considering the objections, the basis for the objections, and the receipt of two certificates from the same state. This was drafted by CRS, right? This is not John Eastman. This is a government bureaucracy. And they tell us it's not that cut and dry. Influenced by historical experience, Congress was concerned in a new statute that two electors could be presented to Congress from the same state, two different electors, and three different contingencies appear to be provided in the statute. What do we do? In the first instance, two lists would be proffered, but the assumption is that only one list would be from electors and that only those should be counted if they were legitimate. In the second case, when two lists were being from two different state authorities who arguably made determinations under the law, the question is which state authority is the lawful tribunal of the state. And so it says to make the decision shall be decided upon the concurrent agreement of both houses supported by the decision of the state. In the third instance, if there is no determination by a state authority which one is lawfully appointed, then they default to the governor. And the House chambers agree. When the two houses agree, then it goes to the governor of the state. But they tell us, even in Congress, they say it's not precisely clear whether the provision for resolving cases applies differently or instead when only one determination is present. Although this section is not free from doubt, its structure seems to indicate that when there is only one determination by the state made in a timely fashion, if the House and Senate split on this, then there's a process. There appears to have been one example, 1961, when the governor of the state of Hawaii first certified electors of Nixon, and then during a subsequent recount, both slates of electors had met on the prescribed day in December, cast their votes, and transmitted them. The House accepted the result of the count, and it was agreed to by unanimous consent. So all of this existed already in the law. It was complicated. So complicated, in fact, that they changed it. This is what they tell us about the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act. This thing is a revision of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, passed in 2022. Isn't that convenient? It was passed and enacted and signed into law by Joe Biden, sponsored by Susan Collins. And what it did here is it clarified the role of the vice president. And they put in this, they said the bill clarifies that VP's role in the counting of the electoral votes is now solely ministerial. There's no power to determine, accept, reject, adjudicate, or resolve any of these disputes. They put it in there. Why? Because it wasn't clear. Because there was an argument that they could have done that. And so Mike Pence maybe did not want to do that. That's fine. That's his prerogative. He can make that conclusion. And many other people in his position probably would have done the same thing. But that doesn't mean that Trump told him to overturn the election. That's not the truth. There is a legitimate argument that this can be done in the Constitution. It was so legitimate that they changed the law to fix it. Now, Ron DeSantis also responded to this. He said, as president, I will end the weaponization of government, replace the FBI director, and ensure a single standard of justice for all Americans. While I've seen reports, I've not read the indictment, which is lame. I do, though, believe we need to enact reform so that Americans have the right to remove cases from Washington, D.C. to their home districts. Ron says, Washington, D.C. is a swamp, and it's unfair to have to stand trial before a jury that's reflective of the swamp mentality. One of the reasons our country is in decline is the politicization of the rule of law. No more excuses. I will end the weaponization of the federal government.